Well, we're back again with Mick Lowe, and Mick has written a book about Satan's choice, the bikers, the law, and of course that ever interesting subject that we all enjoy hearing about but wouldn't want to participate in, murder. Mick, you've been a journalist in the Sudbury region now and, well, all over Ontario for how many years?
15 years in Sudbury, Jim.
Right, and most people in this region have read your articles either in local papers or in the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, Maclean's Magazine, and so on. But I'm not going to get into that tonight, although I would like to talk about some of those other stories because I've enjoyed them very much. But this book you've written a book about murder. You've written a book about how one night a fellow was sitting in a bar and somebody came in and put 3 bullets in his head. And you've got theories about this crime, and of course it's all written up in this Conspiracy of Brothers, which is the title of your book. How did you get interested in this subject? Would you tell us something about it?
Sure. 3 years ago, you may remember, we had a trial here in Sudbury. It was called the Shoe Murder Trial, involving 8 convicts from Millhaven Institution. And there was fantastic, incredible security downtown at the courthouse. It was quite a scene. And I covered it for the Globe and Mail. And in the course of that, I phoned an old friend, a prison activist in Vancouver, just to get some quotes. And a few days later, across my desk comes this parcel. And she says, if you're interested in prison stories, check this out. Well, it was a letter from a man named Gary Como, who'd been convicted of first-degree murder. He was serving 25 years down in Kingston. And he claimed to be innocent. And contained in the package were some documents which intrigued me, which tended to cast some new light on his conviction. So I began then to check through the library the clippings about this trial, which took place in 1979. I made a foray down to Kingston. The Globe sent me down there to talk to some of these guys, Rick Sauvé, Gary Como. The more I listened to them, the more I began to think, gee, maybe there really is something here. And so I wound up spending 11 months researching what really happened in Port Hope on the night of October 18th, 1978.
Okay, before we get into what happened that night, October the 18th in Port Hope, when a man had 3 bullets put in his head, in other words, half his head was probably blown away. Now, when you first started getting involved with this case, you must have been like most of us. I mean, when we hear the word bikers, when we hear the word outlaws or Satan's choice, I mean, certainly most of us say, hey, I wouldn't want to get involved with those people. I don't even know whether I'd want to write about them. Now, what changed your mind?
Well, I was extremely wary. I had no particular preconceptions. I had no interest in bikers. I basically have covered hard rock mining in northern Ontario over the years, and I probably wouldn't even have stopped to read a story about bikers. So my first thought was, well, maybe these guys have got a bad rap, you know, bikers as a group, and maybe it's stereotyping, maybe it's media, maybe it's not fair. So I thought, gee, maybe underneath it all, there's a different story. But the more I read their magazines, the more I went through the clippings that a lot of these guys have kept over the years, the more I realized, no, that theory doesn't work. They are, in fact, guilty of many of the things that they're accused of. So then I decided to turn it around and question, how do we as a society relate to them? How do we treat them, especially how do we treat them in the criminal justice system? And this case, this murder trial, turned out to be a very, very interesting study in how we treat a voluntary, visible minority that says, screw you, I'm living outside the law, to heck with you. Well, what do we do with those people, and how have we dealt with them over the years? That intrigued me.
Okay, so, and possibly also you're the kind of reporter and journalist who does look at all sides of the question, and from what I've seen in the past, is not afraid to step into an issue that perhaps would not be popular with everyone. Tell us what happened in Port Hope.
Well, on the night of October 18th, 1978, at a bar, a fairly seedy bar in the middle of downtown Port Hope, a man, Bill Madiak, an outlaw biker himself, was killed. As you said, 38 shots were fired into his head at point-blank range. Just before the murder took place, a dozen men had entered the bar. Public place, there were perhaps 30 eyewitnesses in the room, watched all of this go down, and 2 of those people, Rick Sauvé and Merv Blaker, were from that area and were well-known members of the Satan's Choice Motorcycle Club. So within hours, the police investigation was underway to round up members of the Satan's Choice, and eventually 8 members of the club were charged with first-degree murder, one of the largest blanket first-degree murder indictments actually in Canadian legal history.
I take it that all 8 of these people were in that bar room that night.
Well, that of course was
That
the
seems
Crown.
strange to me, but anyway, go ahead.
That was the Crown contention, that all 8 of them were there. We now know, in fact, that 2 of the 8 were not there. They were not even in Port Hope, and 6 of the accused were there. However, that isn't exactly how the convictions went. The trial lasted 3 months. It was held in London, and it was a change of venue in 1979, and it was up to that time the longest murder trial in Canadian history. 6 were convicted. Rick Sauvé and Gary Como were convicted of first-degree murder. 4 members of the Satan's Choice were convicted of second-degree murder, and the other 2 were acquitted. One of the 2 who was acquitted was nowhere near the hotel the night of the murder, and he had a successful alibi defense. The other was in fact in the hotel, a participant, if you will, in these events, but he was acquitted for lack of evidence.
Okay, I've read the book. And Como and Sauvé were, of course, convicted for first-degree murder. Were both of them sitting at the table with Bill Maddock?
They were
according
both
to
at the
themselves.
table, according to themselves, and also according to a number of the eyewitnesses. They were sitting at the table with Bill Maddock at the instant that he was shot.
Okay, but you somehow feel, I sense this from reading the book, that there's a question here raised in the book that they received a raw deal.
Well, Gary Como is one of the interesting cases. He sat throughout his own trial, after being identified positively by 2 eyewitnesses as the gunman. He sat through the entire trial with a bullet from the murder weapon inside his body. Now, obviously, if he had a slug from the weapon that killed the other guy in his body, he'd been shot himself, in other words, he couldn't have been the trigger man. But 2 eyewitnesses, the media, the Crown attorney, everybody said, this is the trigger man, this is the guy who did it. And Como was forced to sit throughout all of the Crown evidence and even some of the defense evidence with this bullet in his body. And the judge and the system wouldn't let it be taken out because there was no proof that he'd been shot the night of the murder. And
so when the request was made, when he made the request that this bullet be taken out of his body during the trial, they said, well, it's not germane to the trial?
First, they had difficulties obtaining x-rays and even finding the bullet. He knew that he'd been shot, but several x-rays proved negative. They couldn't find the bullet inside his body. Finally, another set of x-rays was done, and sure enough, clear as life, there was a picture of a projectile. Everyone looked, and they all agreed. So his lawyer said, please, now can we go to the hospital and have this removed and taken to forensics and examined to prove that it, in fact, came from the murder weapon. And the judge said no, because there's no proof that the bullet entered his body that night. So it was catch-22.
Okay, look. These fellas were from Satan's Choice. Now, obviously, there was some kind of a feud going on between Bill Maddock, who was with the Outlaws?
The Golden Hawk Riders,
Oh,
and he was with a couple of outlaws that night, yeah.
All right, so there was a feud going on between these people. Bill gets murdered. These guys are all there. Had they just innocently walked into that bar room? Or?
No, and they certainly weren't there to drink beer, and there was bad blood between Bill Maddock and members of the Satan's Choice. The police immediately concluded, not unreasonably, that this was a cold-blooded gangland-style execution. Bullets to the head, public place, very, very arrogant and horrifying act in the middle of your community.
Well, had they gone down there to see this guy?
They had gone down there to see him, but what they didn't know was that he himself had a gun, and the gun was found on his body the next morning. And when Rick Sauvé went to sit down at his table, according to Sauvé, Maddock threatened him with the gun in his pocket. It was very quiet at the table. There was no argument. There was no fight. No reason for people to really pay any attention to it.
What did Maddock say to him?
Maddock said, I see you've got 9 friends in here tonight. And Sauvé said, what are you talking about? Or he says, I see you've got a lot of friends in here tonight. Sauvé says, what are you talking about? He says, well, I got 9 friends of my own right here. Sauvé was sitting at point-blank range. He was frightened. So he sat there, didn't make a move, hoping that something... Bill Maddock, by the way, was intoxicated and also stoned on speed. And he could see that he was very, very frightened. They'd come in there to do something to Maddock. I don't think there's too much doubt about that. At the very least, to have a meeting. I think they probably wanted to pick a fight with him. He weighed 320 pounds. Very powerful man himself. So Gary Como came and sat down at the table. He immediately saw that Madiak had a gun. He threatened he threatened Como, you make a move, your friend's getting it. So he froze. This may have taken 30 seconds, 2 minutes, very short period of time. Another one of the Satan's Choice group came up to the table. Madiak said, back off, I've got a gun. He went back to the rest of the group and said, the guy's got a gun. We're in trouble here. And one of the Satan's Choice came in, literally from left field, in that fast, pumped 3 rounds into Madiak's head, and then they all split the hotel.
Okay, now, anybody listening to this, Mick, would say right off the bat, well, they went down there to pick a fight with this guy.
Or have a meeting or whatever.
Or whatever.
Up to no good.
Right. Number 2, they were sitting with him. Number 3, it was one of the gang members who shot Bill Madiak. So what's the beef?
Well, first of all, the gunman was never charged and has never been convicted of the crime to this day. Secondly, the 6 guys who were sent to prison for this have all maintained from day one that they were innocent. They were innocent of aiding and abetting a planned and deliberate murder. They were also innocent of intent, and they have maintained this story now, each one of them, for 10 years, despite the prison system, which urges you to, confess your guilt and begin your rehabilitation. They won't. They say, we never planned to kill the guy. That was not our intent when we went in there. And we're innocent. We might be guilty of manslaughter or assault or something like that, but first-degree murder, 25 years of my life, I didn't do it, and I didn't intend to do it.
So both Como and Sauvé, who were sitting at the table with Bill Madiak, were found guilty of first-degree murder, but neither one of them pulled the trigger.
That's correct. Ultimately, the bullet was removed from Como's body. The forensic scientists said there, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that bullet had been fired, had actually grazed Madiak's body before entering Como, and Como had come within this much of being killed himself by this third bullet. The judge knew it and told the jury, I don't think there's any way in the world that you can now say that Como was the gunman. Nonetheless, the jury was convinced that this had been a planned and deliberate murder, and in Canadian law, you, if you participate in a crime, are as guilty as the actual perpetrator of the crime. So, a total of 90 years of prison time has been meted out to these six guys.
Okay. Now, in reading your book, Mick, one can't read it without coming away with a very strong impression that there's a belief out there that somehow or other we talk about the brotherhood of the bikers, but that you also have seen through your investigation, that there's also a brotherhood of, let's say, law authority. Now, what is your impression of what happened with regard to the other side of the equation? On the one side of the coin, there's the bikers, but on the other side, there's the authorities, the Ontario Provincial Police, and so forth. What's the view there?
It's a book primarily, but not exclusively, about bikers, and I talk about 3 brotherhoods. There's the brotherhood of the bikers, yes, but there's also the brotherhood of the police and the brotherhood of the lawyers and the judges. Each separate and distinct, each with its own code of ethics and honor and so on. I came to some very disturbing and I think startling conclusions, especially about the police. It now seems clear in hindsight that critical evidence, which would have exonerated David T.H. Hoffman, one of the 4 guys convicted of second-degree murder, who said right from the outset, I was 200 miles away, I was in Kitchener-Waterloo that night, that's where he lived. He took the stand in his own defense, tried to establish an alibi. It didn't work. He was convicted of a murder that he had nothing to do with, was not anywhere near. And in the possession of the police all the time were wiretaps of telephone conversations that Hoffman had had that night from a telephone in Kitchener. But these were never disclosed to the defense before the trial. They did come to light 2 years later. He'd spent 2 years in Millhaven for this murder. By sheer coincidence, his lawyer, Brian Greenspan, his appeal lawyer, learned of these tapes, got a hold of them, introduced them as evidence, fresh evidence, at the Ontario Court of Appeal, and the justices said, yeah, gee, when you listen to him on the phone, it doesn't sound like he has any intention of hanging up the phone and driving 200 miles to take part in a murder. We order a new trial. So that's one of the very clear questions and problems that I have with the way the police investigation was conducted.
You also point in your book to the fact that there seemed to be in Ontario at that time a climate where through the newspapers, through journalists, through the government officials, even as high as Roy McMurtry, the Attorney General of the day. There was a climate where a great deal of fear was felt by the public of these bikers. Look, we're told, and we have no reason not to believe, that these people are involved in prostitution, in drugs, in all kinds of things that
Enforcement, strong arm. Sure.
are very, very violent and brutal. But is that the entire picture?
Well, it may well be that all of those things are true of individual members of bike clubs. But what I discovered, and this is a book that takes place, really, it examines a history over 30 years of the bike clubs in Ontario, is that there has been a secret, dirty little war going on between the Ontario Provincial Police, the Special Squad, the SS, better known as the Biker Squad, and these bike clubs. And it's been waged across the length and breadth of the province. There have been incidents where the police themselves became almost like bikers in order to fight the bikers. There have been incidents, which I document in the book for the first time, where the bikers literally ran hundreds of police off a field that could have led to really serious bloodshed. And that is where, if we constitute ourselves as a law-abiding society, and we say we are better, we're superior, and we're in a position to judge, and we will not countenance this kind of behavior, if we say that to this group, and this group sees our people, our good guys, our police, acting, breaking laws, harassing, using strong-arm tactics, using many of the same strategy and tactics as the bikers themselves, then where does that leave us as a society, and what kind of a signal is that sending to the bikers? That really makes them think more than ever, to heck with you. You know, all I see of the straight society are cops in the insides of prisons. What I see there is unfair, it's arbitrary. I'm often being arrested for something I didn't do. I'm being harassed at every turn. I'm under constant surveillance, whether I intend to do a crime or not. Not a happy signal, I think, to send to these people that somehow we are, as a society, upholding the rule of law.
But wouldn't a society, Mick, and perhaps I'm using too broad a term, but wouldn't many people in the society in which we live today say, well, look, these people are such tough customers, and because of their, quote, criminal activities, which are considered to be very vile by many, many people, that the police have to take extraordinary measures. Now, what is the answer to that? I think you've given part of the answer, but would you like to comment on that?
Sure. It's a question of, does the means justify the end? And if we're going to allow law breaking in the name of law enforcement against bikers, then who's next? Is it Sikhs? Is it homosexuals? Is it people with long hair or people with blue eyes and red hair? It's a very scary prospect. At the very least, I think the public should know. Now, they may say, given bikers' track records, I have no use for them, lock them all up and throw away the key, we'll look the other way. And I think that's what people have been doing for 20 years. And perhaps that's a legitimate answer. But at the very least, I think the public should know what's being done in their name in order to try to put these people down. And also, it's not working, Jim. The Satan's Choice now is up to over 100 members. They're back to the strength they were at roughly in 1977. Outlaw clubs are thriving across Canada, and this in-your-face law enforcement approach, just from a pragmatic standpoint, it may keep them off balance. Maybe the problem would be worse. I'm not sure, but it's not been that successful to date, I don't think.
Well, you certainly raise a very interesting point when you talk about, does the means justify the end? Certainly that's something that we can all understand, and of course we would all have to pose that question for ourselves in our own mind. Well, who did kill Bill Madiuk?
Well,
you did spend a lot of time. Who did it? And
at the trial, a member of the Satan's Choice who was not charged, a man named Lauren Campbell, took the witness stand under oath and under the protection of the Canada Evidence Act and testified, I did the shooting, and spelled it all out in very great detail. The Crown Attorney, naturally, was at considerable pains to knock this guy down, because after all, what you'd be saying to the jury then is, we've charged 8 guys, we've had this massive manhunt and investigation, we've got all these eyewitnesses, and we got the wrong man. The gunman was not one of the 8. So the Crown was very hard on Campbell. Campbell had a perjury conviction, but he fit some of the requisite descriptions of the gunman. For example, he was left-handed, as was the gunman, according to the eyewitnesses. He was not believed. He was not believed by the jury, by the judge. Even many of the defense lawyers there, who believe to this day that he did the killing, said that he was an incredible witness on the witness stand. So, despite the fact that he came forward, the Crown was able to say, well, you're up here to get these other guys off, and persuaded the jury that he was not telling the truth. I believe his testimony.
That's what I was going to ask you. After all your investigation, your discussions, and how much time did you spend putting this book together?
It's been almost 3 years working on this.
Yeah. And tell me now, Mick, as I said, I mean, many of us would be very reluctant to attempt to do this kind of investigation, first of all because of the reputation of bikers, and because of the attitude of society towards these people. But when you were doing this, did you ever have any trepidations, any fears, or
Sure.
did you feel completely comfortable the whole time you were
Oh, no.
investigating the bikers
No,
and what
I
happened?
went a lot of strange places. I met a lot of people that I would never, ever have met under any other circumstances. I had a great deal of trepidation at times. I was traveling by myself into cities where I'd never been, in some cases. They, however, were wary of me.
Well, that's what I wondered
as it turns
about.
out.
Because I read in your book and about how the Kitchener-Waterloo newspaper, 2 reporters from that paper won over the leadership of the local Kitchener-Waterloo group. I guess it was Satan's Choice?
That's right.
And then, of course, wrote a very inflammatory series of articles. So they had no reason to trust the press. How did you manage to win them over enough to trust you? Because, as you say, they would have to be wary of you, Mick. If they read any of your columns about the mining industry or about any of the other kinds of things you've written, surely to God, they would have to have second thoughts. Now, how did you do it?
I'm not the kind of guy you'd buy a used tractor from.
Well, I don't know about that.
I tell you, it's their brotherhood and their loyalty, their intense loyalty to one another. These guys in prison would never, ever inform on the killer. At no time would they ever mention his name or say he did it or anything else. Walk me, I'll make a deal. They will not, they have not, and they never will implicate the actual killer. That's point 1. Point 2 is that there's a tremendous bond among these guys on the street, in jail. They keep in touch. So once Gary Como managed to kind of fish me into the thing and put me on the chase, that was part of the reason that they were at least willing to sit and talk to me. And by the way, Jim, I've never done an investigative piece like this, that people were phoning me. Members of the motorcycle club were phoning me long distance and saying, I'm so-and-so, I understand that you're looking into this, I would like to meet with you, and I'd like to talk to you. And in only one case did someone ask to not have their name appear on the interview. And that also is really unique in investigative reporting. Most of the time, everybody's diving for cover. But these people, no matter what the consequences might be for themselves, the guys on the street were willing to talk to me and use their real names, which I find remarkable. So I had that going for me. I knew that there were guys in jail doing 25 years, that I was their only hope.
Did you ever go to Millhaven?
No, I was in Collins Bay. I've been to Joyceville. I've been to Warkworth. I never have visited Millhaven.
Would you like to be in one of those places?
Especially not Millhaven. It's a dreadful. At the end of the book, we talk about it a little bit, and it is a really horrific. If you're not a brute when you're sent there, then you're almost certainly going to be one when you get out, because it's the things these guys witnessed.
Well, how does it brutalize people? I mean, what is it about Millhaven and those kinds of places that brutalizes people? I mean, you've gone to Collins Bay, and then you've looked around, you've talked to these people. What makes you say that it's horrific?
The murders, the beatings, the slashings, the despair, the suicides are at Millhaven almost a daily occurrence. People have lost hope. They're cut off from the outside world. With this 25-year prison sentence now for first-degree murder, you have no hope of getting out. I mean, Rick Sauvé, for example, had never spent a night in jail. He was 23, I think, when he was convicted. He'll be eligible for parole in 2003. He had a 6-year-old daughter. He'll probably be a grandfather by the time he comes out. His daughter's in high school now. The thought of spending that much time locked away, isolated from the rest of society, it builds despair. You're alienated. That's part of it. The system is arbitrary. It's brutal, and the inmates can be brutal one with another. There are, I think there's some problem with drugs there. Everybody's hustling for something or other. Millhaven is also famous for its cliques. The French-Canadian clique, the black clique, the Indian clique. There's a biker clique now, the Rounder clique from West Toronto. You have to band together for sheer physical survival. So then you get into a kind of a gang. It's a jungle. And it really is like going back to the jungle in a primitive state. And yet this is an institution that we spend millions of dollars to maintain, to keep these guys in there. And well, it's quite a story.
Well, Mick, it certainly is a story. And Mick Lowe has written just an outstanding book. I couldn't put it down. I spent all of last evening reading it, and to tell you the truth, I spent another hour or so today, Mick. And it's a book about murder, about Satan's choice. It's about the law. It's a real grabber, and I would highly recommend it. Thank you, Mick, for coming in.
Thank you, Jim.
It was nice seeing you. And recently, the Sudbury branch of the Canadian Mental Health Association held their second-hand fashion show here in Sudbury. We have an insert now about that.